They were investigated, judged, and filed away. Tonight, we revisit 3 crimes history nearly forgot. In the late summer of 1868, Cincinnati, Ohio, stood at a crossroads between growth and unease. The Civil War had ended only 3 years earlier, and the city was expanding rapidly, its population swelling as laborers, immigrants, and families crowded into dense neighborhoods near factories, rail lines, and river traffic. Streets were busy from dawn to dusk. Children played in vacant lots and along unpaved roads, while adults worked long hours, trusting that familiarity and routine offered some measure of safety. Yet beneath that sense of normalcy, anxiety was rising. Newspapers regularly carried reports of theft, assault, and violence. Law enforcement existed, but resources were limited, and investigations often relied as much on community cooperation as official procedure. In working-class districts especially, families depended on one another, watching each other's children and sharing warnings when something felt wrong. The Mohrman family lived within this environment. Like many households of the time, their life was modest and structured around daily routines. Their youngest daughter, Mary Mohrman, was a small child, young enough to spend her days close to home, playing with neighborhood children under informal supervision rather than constant adult oversight. Nothing about her family set them apart. They were not prominent, wealthy, or isolated. They were ordinary residents of a city that believed it understood itself. As summer waned and September approached, there was no sense within the Mohrman household or the surrounding neighborhood that anything was about to change. Days followed predictable patterns. Children went out to play and returned home by evening. Doors remained unlocked. Trust, though cautious, still existed. This was the quiet before disruption, the final moment when Cincinnati's routines held firm and the idea of sudden, irreversible loss had not yet forced itself into the lives of those who would soon be at the center of it. As we continue, let us know where you're listening from and what time it is there. And if you follow forgotten cases like this, consider subscribing so these stories aren't lost to history. On Sunday, September 6, 1868, the day unfolded without distinction. It was a mild afternoon, and as was customary, Mary Mohrman left her home to play nearby. The neighborhood was familiar ground. Vacant lots, short streets, and common gathering places where children regularly spent their free hours. Nothing about her departure appeared unusual or alarming. Several residents later recalled seeing children playing together that afternoon. Their accounts were ordinary in nature. Small groups running between yards, lingering near open spaces, passing the time as they had many times before. Among these recollections, one detail would later stand out. A man, unfamiliar to some of the residents, was observed in the vicinity of the children. He was not interacting openly, nor was he creating a disturbance. He was simply present, close enough to be noticed, distant enough to draw no immediate challenge. As the afternoon wore on, children gradually began returning to their homes. Mary did not. At first her absence caused little concern. Delays were common, and children often lost track of time while playing. But as daylight began to fade and the streets quieted, unease set in. Mary's family waited, expecting her to appear at any moment. When she did not, they stepped outside, calling her name and scanning the nearby lots and walkways she was known to frequent. Neighbors were asked if they had seen her. No one could say where she had gone after the afternoon hours. As evening approached, uncertainty replaced routine. The familiar paths Mary walked each day now felt unsettled. The search widened outward from her leg, its known surroundings driven by growing concern and the sudden realization that something was wrong, though no one yet understood how deeply that day would mark them. As night settled over the neighborhood, the Mohrman family's concern hardened into fear. Neighbors were alerted, first one household and then another, until word spread along the surrounding streets that a child had not come home. What began as individual efforts quickly turned collective. Small groups moved through familiar paths with lanterns and calls carried into the dark. Men searched vacant lots where children often gathered during the day. Others checked behind outbuildings, along fences, and through narrow alleys that cut between rows of houses. Doors were knocked on, yards entered with permission, and sheds opened. Each location was examined carefully, not because it seemed dangerous, but because nothing could be overlooked. Before long, authorities were notified. Officers arrived and began organizing the search more systematically, dividing areas and directing residents where to look. Attention turned toward spaces that bordered the neighborhood, rail lines, embankments, and routes leading toward the Ohio River. The river itself became a point of concern, its proximity forcing searchers to consider possibilities they had hoped to avoid. Lantern light flickered across uneven ground as hours passed, with no sign of what everyone was looking for. The search continued late into the night, voices growing hoarse, feet tired, determination sustained by the belief that answers were close at hand. Each empty lot and unbroken stretch of ground added to the strain. By the early morning hours, exhaustion began to set in. The night had yielded nothing, no trace, no clothing, no clear direction. People returned to their homes reluctantly, leaving officers to maintain watch and plan for daylight. The neighborhood, once loud with movement and purpose, fell quiet again. But it was no longer a familiar quiet. It carried the weight of unanswered questions. The situation had moved beyond a simple misunderstanding. On the morning following the search, daylight revealed what darkness had concealed. A local woman, moving through a vacant lot not far from the surrounding homes, noticed something out of place among the grass and debris. At first it appeared to be discarded clothing, an object easily overlooked in an area often used as a shortcut or dumping ground. As she moved closer, the shape and stillness of what lay there became unmistakable. The realization came abruptly. What she had found was not abandoned fabric, but the body of a child. Word spread quickly, and authorities were summoned at once. Officers arrived and secured the area, pushing back onlookers as the scene was examined. The lot, moments earlier unremarkable, became the center of the neighborhood's attention. Residents gathered along the edges, their reactions marked by shock and disbelief. Some recognized the clothing immediately. Others turned away, unable to look. Conversations fell into hushed fragments as the weight of the discovery settled in. What had been feared during the night was now undeniable. The location itself deepened the sense of unease. The vacant lot was not remote or hidden. It lay within the same area searched the night before, an open space passed through by neighbors and searchers alike. The implication was troubling. Either the body had been missed despite careful effort, or it had been placed there after the search had already moved on. In a single morning, uncertainty gave way to certainty. The case was no longer about a child who had wandered too far. It had become something far darker, and the neighborhood understood that whatever answers lay ahead would come at a cost far greater than anyone had imagined the day before. Following the discovery, the body was formally examined under the authority of the county coroner. A physician was called to conduct a medical inspection, and an inquest was convened to establish the cause and circumstances of death according to legal procedure. The process was methodical, recorded in official terms, and intended to remove uncertainty where possible. The physician's findings were presented in restrained, clinical language. The examination determined that death was the result of violent injury, consistent with strangulation. Marks observed on the neck and surrounding areas supported this conclusion. No indication was given that death had occurred naturally or by accident. The findings were clear enough to establish that the child had been intentionally killed. The condition of the body was documented without embellishment. The physician noted signs that death had not occurred immediately prior to discovery, indicating that the body had been exposed for a period of time. This assessment carried important implications. It suggested that death had taken place hours earlier, aligning with the time the child was last seen alive, and narrowing the window in which the crime could have occurred. These conclusions were formally entered into the inquest record. The coroner's jury reviewed the medical testimony and agreed with the determination that the death was a homicide caused by deliberate human action. No suspect was named at this stage, and no motive was proposed. The inquest's role was limited to establishing fact, not assigning blame. With the inquest concluded, the case moved beyond uncertainty. What had begun as a disappearance was now officially recognized as a murder, placing the responsibility for the next steps squarely in the hands of investigators and marking the beginning of a far more serious legal process. News of the inquest spread rapidly throughout all Cincinnati. Local newspapers reported the findings in direct, unsettling terms, and the details circulated far beyond the immediate neighborhood. What had happened was no longer a private tragedy. It became a citywide concern, discussed in homes, workplaces, and public spaces. Fear followed quickly. Parents grew wary of letting children out of sight, even in familiar areas. Ordinary routines were interrupted by suspicion and unease. Alongside fear came anger, directed at the unknown individual responsible, but also at the uncertainty surrounding the case. Many demanded answers that authorities could not yet provide. Public pressure intensified when a reward was offered for information leading to an arrest and conviction. The announcement was meant to encourage cooperation, but it also heightened expectations. Every delay, every lack of progress was now measured against the urgency created by public attention and financial incentive. Criticism of the police emerged almost immediately. Some questioned how a crime of this nature could occur in a populated area. Others focused on the search itself, asking how the body could be found in a location already examined. Editorials and public conversations reflected a growing belief that mistakes had been made, even if no clear explanation existed. As days passed without an arrest, scrutiny sharpened. Investigators faced mounting demands to act decisively. The case was no longer driven solely by evidence. It was shaped by a city's insistence on resolution. This collective pressure would soon influence the direction of the investigation, narrowing focus and accelerating decisions in ways that would define what came next. With public pressure mounting, investigators moved quickly to identify possible suspects. Several individuals were detained in the days following the inquest, most of them questioned because of proximity, PR, a reputation or behavior that appeared suspicious in hindsight. These were not arrests based on direct evidence, but precautionary holds driven by circumstance and urgency. Suspicion often rested on thin ground. Some men had been seen in the neighborhood on the day of the disappearance. Others were known to spend time near vacant lots or had prior encounters with law enforcement unrelated to the crime. In a climate shaped by fear and expectation, these associations were enough to prompt interrogation. Each case, however, unraveled under scrutiny. Witness accounts failed to place any suspect at a decisive moment. Timelines did not align. Physical evidence was either absent or inconclusive. When statements were compared and checked, inconsistencies favored release rather than charge. Investigators were forced to acknowledge that suspicion alone could not withstand legal standards. As detainees were released, frustration grew. To the public, each failed arrest felt like a step backward. Confidence in the investigation weakened, and criticism sharpened. Rumors spread more quickly than verified information, and speculation filled the gaps left by official silence. By the end of this phase, the investigation showed signs of strain. Leads were exhausted as quickly as they appeared. No suspect remained in custody, and no clear path forward had emerged. The case slowed, not because interest had faded, but because certainty remained out of reach, leaving both authorities and the public suspended in a state of unresolved tension. More than a year passed without resolution. By the autumn of 1869, public attention had dulled, though the memory of the earlier crime had not disappeared. Then, in October of that year, a new incident abruptly reopened old fears. Another young girl was assaulted in Cincinnati under circumstances that immediately drew the attention of authorities. The child survived and was able to give an account of what had happened. According to her testimony, she had been approached by a man who engaged her briefly before leading her away from public view. The encounter turned violent, but the assault was interrupted, allowing her to escape. Her description of the attacker was taken seriously, not because it offered certainty, but because it provided detail that had been absent before. Investigators noted similarities between this assault and the earlier case. The age of the victim, the method of approach, and the location all aligned closely enough to raise concern. While no direct connection could be proven, the parallels were strong enough to revive an investigation that had largely stalled. The survivor's testimony became central. Her account was documented and compared against prior witness statements from the earlier case. For the first time, authorities believed they had a living source of information rather than circumstantial fragments. As a result, attention began to narrow. Rather than casting a wide net across the city, investigators focused on individuals whose movements and behavior aligned with both incidents. The case shifted direction, not through assumption, but through the emergence of a pattern that demanded closer examination and suggested that the earlier crime had not been an isolated act. As investigators reassessed earlier information in light of the second assault, attention increasingly centered on one individual, William Hanland. He was not a prominent figure, nor someone previously charged in connection with the murder, but his name surfaced repeatedly as authorities compared witness statements and timelines. Hanland was known to spend time in the same areas where children commonly gathered. Multiple witnesses from the neighborhood had independently recalled seeing him in the vicinity on the afternoon Mary was last seen, though none had initially viewed his presence as remarkable. These sightings gained new significance only after they were examined alongside later events. Investigators also began to note patterns in Hanland's behavior. Accounts described him lingering rather than passing through, observing rather than engaging. His movements appeared unstructured, placing him in public spaces without clear purpose. While none of these details constituted proof, they aligned uncomfortably with the circumstances surrounding both incidents. Further inquiry into Hanland's prior movements revealed that he had been in Cincinnati at the relevant times and had no verified explanation that removed him from the area during the critical window. Opportunity, rather than motive, became the central focus. Authorities were careful to rely on what could be established through testimony and records, avoiding assumptions unsupported by evidence. Based on the accumulation of these factors, witness sightings, behavioral observations, and proximity, Hanland was taken into custody. The arrest did not signal the end of uncertainty. It marked a shift from speculation toward formal scrutiny. For the first time since the crime, investigators believed they had a suspect whose presence and actions could be examined within a structured legal process, bringing the case into its most consequential phase. While William Hanland remained in custody awaiting further proceedings, a new and controversial element entered the case. A fellow inmate came forward claiming that Hanland had confessed to the crime while they were confined together. According to this account, the confession was made informally, without witnesses, during ordinary conversation inside the jail. The inmate provided details that he claimed came directly from Hanland, describing statements that aligned broadly with known aspects of the case. These assertions were documented and relayed to authorities, immediately drawing attention because they appeared to offer what investigators had so far lacked: an admission of guilt. However, the circumstances surrounding the claim raised immediate concerns. The alleged confession was not recorded, nor was it made in the presence of law enforcement. Questions arose regarding the inmate's motives. At the time, it was common for incarcerated individuals to seek reduced sentences, favorable treatment, or other benefits in exchange for cooperation. Whether such incentives were explicitly promised or merely assumed became a point of scrutiny. Authorities treated the statement cautiously. It was neither dismissed outright nor accepted as conclusive proof. Instead, it was added to the growing body of evidence to be evaluated alongside witness testimony and established facts. Investigators sought corroboration, aware that unverified jailhouse confessions were inherently unreliable. Public reaction was divided. Some viewed the claim as the long-awaited confirmation of guilt. Others expressed skepticism, wary of placing decisive weight on the word of a prisoner with unclear incentives. The case, rather than becoming clearer, entered a phase defined by competing interpretations, where credibility itself became a central issue and certainty remained elusive. When the case finally came to trial, public interest was intense. The courtroom was crowded daily, filled with spectators drawn by the gravity of the charge and the long uncertainty that had preceded it. The atmosphere was tense but restrained, reflecting both the seriousness of the proceedings and the awareness that the outcome rested on imperfect evidence rather than direct proof. The prosecution structured its case around accumulation rather than a single decisive fact. Witnesses testified to having seen William Hanland in the vicinity on the day of the disappearance. The survivor of the later assault described her encounter and identified similarities in the man who attacked her. The prosecution also presented the jailhouse confession claim, arguing that it reinforced what circumstantial evidence already suggested. Together, these elements were offered as a coherent pattern rather than isolated incidents. The defense focused on doubt. Attorneys challenged the reliability of witness recollections made long after the events in question. They emphasized the lack of physical evidence directly linking Hanland to the crime and questioned the credibility of the inmate who alleged a confession, highlighting the possibility of personal gain. The defense argued that suspicion had hardened into assumption under public pressure. Testimony frequently conflicted, timelines overlapped imperfectly, descriptions varied in detail. Each side interpreted these inconsistencies differently, one as natural variation, the other as proof of uncertainty. When the case was submitted to the jury, the central question was not whether the crime had occurred, but whether the evidence met the threshold required for conviction. Jurors were tasked with weighing inference against reasonable doubt, knowing that their decision would permanently resolve a case the city had struggled to understand for more than a year. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. The decision brought an abrupt end to months of investigation, testimony, and public debate. In the courtroom, the announcement was met with a mixture of relief and restraint. There was no celebration, only the recognition that a conclusion, however imperfect, had been reached. Following the verdict, the Court P proceeded to sentencing. William Hanland was sentenced to death, the punishment prescribed under Ohio law for the crime of murder. The sentence was formally recorded, and the date of execution was set in accordance with legal procedure. With that ruling, the trial phase of the case closed, and the matter moved fully into the hands of the penal system. Public reaction was immediate. Many citizens expressed satisfaction that the case had finally been resolved after more than a year of uncertainty. For others, the verdict brought quiet unease, shaped by lingering questions about the strength of the evidence rather than the severity of the crime itself. The city did not speak with a single voice, but the prevailing sentiment was one of closure. Newspapers reported the outcome prominently, summarizing the verdict, the sentence, and the key points of the trial. Editorials reflected the same divide seen among the public, some affirming confidence in the justice system, others urging reflection on the limits of circumstantial proof. Legally, the case was now settled. Appeals were exhausted or denied, and no further proceedings altered the outcome. The court's judgment stood as final, marking the end of the judicial process and setting the stage for the case's last official chapter. The execution of William Hanland was carried out according to the sentence imposed by the court. On the appointed date, he was taken to the designated execution site, where the procedure was conducted under official supervision and in compliance with the legal standards of the time. Attendance was limited to authorized witnesses, including prison officials and representatives of the state. In the middle decades of the 19th century, rural Vermont was defined by isolation, subsistence farming, and quiet endurance. Small communities were scattered across rough land, where families depended almost entirely on what their fields could yield and what their labor could sustain. Life was repetitive, demanding, and largely unseen beyond the boundaries of one's town. It was within this environment that Alice Meaker came of age. Records place her early life firmly within this rural world, shaped by hard physical work and the expectations placed on women to manage households under constant economic pressure. She later married Alman Meaker, a local farmer whose livelihood depended on maintaining livestock and cultivating land that offered little margin for failure. Together they established a household typical of the period, one defined by long days, limited resources, and an unspoken understanding that survival came before comfort. The Meaker farm was not prosperous. Like many families of the era, they lived close to necessity, raising multiple children while relying on seasonal labor and inconsistent harvests. Cash was scarce, and the household economy depended heavily on every member contributing work, whether in the fields or within the home. Illness, poor yields, or the loss of labor could destabilize the entire family. At this early stage, nothing about the Meaker household appeared unusual to neighbors. It resembled countless other rural Vermont families, quiet, hard-working, and bound by the rhythms of agrarian life. This outward normalcy would later stand in stark contrast to what unfolded behind closed doors. Cases like this remain known only because someone chose to record them, preserve them, and return to them years later. If you find value in these forgotten histories, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps ensure stories like this continue to be told. And as we begin, feel free to share in the comments where you're listening from. Marriage in rural Vermont during the mid-19th century offered little relief from hardship. For Alice and Alman Meaker, married life quickly became an extension of the same demanding conditions they had known since youth. Children arrived in steady succession, as was common for farming families, each birth adding both emotional weight and practical responsibility to a household already stretched thin. Raising children on a small farm required constant labor. Food had to be grown, preserved, and rationed carefully. Clothing was mended repeatedly rather than replaced. Winters were long, isolating families for months at a time, while summers demanded relentless physical effort from dawn until nightfall. For Alice, domestic work did not end with housekeeping alone. It was inseparable from agricultural survival. Every task, hauling water, tending animals, preparing meals, was tied directly to the family's ability to endure. Poverty deepened the family's isolation. With limited access to cash or outside assistance, the Meakers depended largely on themselves. Social contact was minimal, often restricted to neighboring farms or church gatherings. This isolation meant that personal struggles were rarely shared and almost never addressed beyond the household walls. The family's vulnerability became tragically clear when one of their biological children died from illness. Such deaths were not uncommon in the 19th century, but they carried lasting consequences. Beyond grief, the loss removed a future laborer from the household and reinforced the fragility of life within the Meaker home. This combination of loss, labor, and isolation formed the quiet pressures that defined the family long before outside children entered their care. The stability of the Meaker household was further disrupted by forces far beyond the boundaries of their farm. During the Civil War, Alman Meaker left Vermont to serve in the Union Army, joining thousands of rural men whose absence removed a critical source of labor from their families. For Alice, the war years meant managing the farm and children largely on her own, under conditions already defined by scarcity and exhaustion. When Alman returned from service, the war did not simply end. Contemporary accounts and later testimony describe him as physically diminished, suffering from significant hearing damage and ongoing illness. Though not uncommon among returning soldiers, these impairments altered his ability to work and communicate effectively. Tasks he once handled became more difficult or impossible, shifting additional burdens onto the household. The effects of his injury were not limited to physical labor. Communication within the family reportedly deteriorated, and daily routines were forced to adapt around his limitations. Economic pressure intensified as productivity declined, and the balance of responsibility within the home changed. Alice's role expanded further, not only as caretaker to children and farm, but also as support for a husband whose health had been permanently compromised. This post-war period marked a subtle but important turning point. The household, already strained by poverty and loss, now faced reduced labor capacity and increased dependency. While outward life on the farm continued much as before, the internal structure of the family had weakened, leaving it less resilient to future pressures that were soon to follow. By the late 19th century, Vermont's orphanage system had become a practical response to poverty, illness, and parental death rather than a formalized welfare structure. Towns were responsible for the care of orphaned or abandoned children, and one common solution was to place them with local families. These arrangements were typically informal contracts. The household received a modest payment from the town in exchange for food, shelter, and supervision, while the children were expected to contribute labor when able. It was through this system that two siblings, Alice and Henry, entered the Meaker household. Records indicate that the children had already experienced instability before their placement, having spent time under institutional care. Their transfer to a farm was viewed by local authorities as both economical and beneficial, reducing town expense while placing the children in what was assumed to be a structured family environment. The arrangement carried financial incentive. The town agreed to compensate the Meakers for taking the children in, a sum intended to offset the cost of their upkeep. For a household under persistent economic strain, this payment represented meaningful support. The children themselves were also seen as potential contributors to farm labor as they grew older. Crucially, the decision to accept Alice and Henry into the home was made by Alman Meaker alone. Testimony later confirmed that Alice Meaker was not consulted beforehand. The children arrived not as a mutual family decision, but as a unilateral action imposed upon an already burdened household. This moment marked a clear fracture within the family structure. What appeared administratively routine to the town introduced tension, resentment, and imbalance into the Meaker home, setting in motion events that would soon draw attention far beyond the quiet boundaries of their farm. Not long after Alice and Henry were placed in the Meaker household, neighbors began to notice behavior that extended beyond the accepted standards of discipline common to the period. While corporal punishment was not unusual in 19th-century rural families, multiple witnesses later described treatment that appeared excessive and persistent. Testimony would confirm that the children were subjected to frequent physical punishment. Accounts reference the use of household objects rather than open-handed correction, delivered repeatedly rather than as isolated incidents. These actions were not concealed. They occurred openly enough that sounds of distress carried beyond the farmhouse. Neighbors recalled hearing cries, thuds, and prolonged periods of shouting that suggested sustained force rather than momentary discipline. Food deprivation was also reported. Witnesses stated that the children were sometimes denied meals or given noticeably less than other members of the household. Such practices, particularly on a working farm where physical labor was expected, placed the children in a visibly weakened state. Their appearance and behavior reflected ongoing neglect rather than temporary hardship. Perhaps most troubling were the threats overheard by those living nearby. Several neighbors later testified that they heard Alice Meaker issue repeated warnings to the children, statements that implied serious harm rather than correction. These threats were delivered loudly enough to be remembered and later recounted under oath. Despite this awareness, no immediate intervention occurred. The community recognized the severity of the treatment, but remained passive, constrained by social norms, uncertainty, and the assumption that household discipline was a private matter. This collective inaction allowed the situation to continue unchecked, reinforcing a pattern of behavior that grew more severe with time and moved steadily toward an irreversible outcome. As concern within the community deepened, attention increasingly focused on Alice Meaker herself. Witness testimony later presented in court described her temperament as harsh and unyielding, particularly in her interactions with the orphaned children. Neighbors and AC. Acquaintances noted a marked difference between her treatment of Alice and Henry and that of her biological children, a distinction that became difficult to ignore over time. Several witnesses stated that the orphaned children were singled out for punishment more frequently and with greater severity. While the Meakers' own children were disciplined within the norms of the period, Alice and Henry were subjected to repeated correction that appeared disproportionate and relentless. This pattern suggested not isolated moments of anger, but a sustained course of behavior directed toward the two children specifically. Threats made by Alice Meaker were recalled with striking consistency across testimonies. Multiple neighbors independently reported hearing her issue warnings that went beyond disciplinary language. These statements, later repeated under oath, implied intentions of serious harm, and were delivered with enough volume and frequency to be remembered long after the fact. The consistency of these accounts strengthened their credibility and reinforced the perception that the danger to the children was ongoing. Importantly, these observations were not speculative. They were drawn from first-hand accounts given by individuals who lived nearby and interacted with the household. As these details accumulated, suspicion narrowed from general concern about the household to specific alarm regarding Alice Meaker's conduct. By the time authorities became involved, a clear pattern had already been established through repeated, corroborated witness statements pointing directly toward her actions. The situation reached a decisive turning point in the autumn of 1869, when the orphaned girl Alice suddenly vanished from the Meaker household. The exact date of her disappearance was later established through testimony and town records, marking the moment when long-standing concern gave way to immediate alarm. When questioned about the child's absence, Alice Meaker initially offered a simple explanation. She claimed that the girl had been sent away from the farm, suggesting that Alice had either left voluntarily or been placed elsewhere. The statement was delivered without urgency and was presented as a routine matter, despite the child's complete disappearance from the area. As neighbors continued to ask questions, inconsistencies began to emerge. Alice Meaker's account shifted in detail, with later statements failing to align with earlier explanations. These contradictions were subtle but noticeable, particularly to those already familiar with the household's troubled history. No destination was clearly identified, no arrangements confirmed, and no witnesses could verify that the child had been seen leaving the property. Concern within the community intensified quickly. Alice had not been known to wander, nor had she shown signs of leaving on her own. Given her age, condition, and prior treatment, her sudden absence raised immediate fears rather than reassurance. The lack of clear answers, combined with the household's reputation for harsh discipline, transformed quiet suspicion into active worry. Within a short period, neighbors brought their concerns to local authorities. What had once been dismissed as a private domestic matter now crossed into public scrutiny, formally initiating the criminal phase of the case and setting events into irreversible motion. As inquiries into Alice's disappearance continued, the explanations offered by the Meaker household began to fracture further. Attention soon turned to statements made by the Meaker's son, whose account of events differed noticeably from that of his mother. When questioned, he provided details that conflicted with Alice Meaker's version of the child's departure, introducing discrepancies that could not be easily reconciled. These inconsistencies deepened existing concerns. Neighbors who had long observed the household came forward with formal testimony, recounting what they had witnessed in the months leading up to the disappearance. Their statements described repeated abuse, threats, and the visible decline of the orphaned children. Taken together, these accounts established a context in which Alice's sudden absence appeared not accidental, but deeply suspicious. What had once circulated quietly as local rumor now became documented fact. The convergence of conflicting family statements and corroborated neighbor testimony created a narrative that demanded official attention. The case was no longer a matter of hearsay or private suspicion. It was supported by multiple independent accounts pointing towards serious wrongdoing. Local authorities were formally notified, and the matter was escalated beyond the immediate community. Law enforcement began structured questioning, separating family members and examining timelines more closely. This marked the moment when control of the situation passed from the Meaker household to the legal system. The transition was swift and decisive. Once authorities intervened, the disappearance of Alice was no longer viewed as a domestic issue, but as a potential crime. The groundwork laid by Contradictions and community alarm ensured that the investigation would proceed with urgency and scrutiny, setting the stage for revelations that would soon follow. Under mounting pressure from investigators, attention shifted decisively toward Alman Meaker. He was questioned by a deputy sheriff away from his wife, a separation that proved critical. Once removed from the immediate influence of the household, Alman's account changed in both tone and substance. According to official records, he abandoned earlier evasions and provided a detailed confession describing these events surrounding Alice's disappearance. Alman admitted that the child had not been sent away, nor had she left of her own accord. Instead, he confessed that poison had been used. He stated that strychnine was obtained prior to the child's disappearance, purchased deliberately and with foreknowledge of its lethal effect. This admission marked the first concrete acknowledgement that Alice's absence was the result of intentional harm. The confession outlined a sequence of actions carried out with calculated intent. Alman described how Alice was taken from the farmhouse and transported by carriage to a remote location near a stream. There, the poison was administered, forcing the child to ingest it. He recounted the physical effects that followed: convulsions and rapid decline, leaving no doubt as to the cause of death. After Alice died, Alman confessed that her body was buried nearby in a shallow grave. The location was described with sufficient specificity to allow authorities to act. This detail transformed the confession from narrative to actionable evidence. The statement was recorded as voluntary and was later entered into the official case record. Its clarity, detail, and internal consistency sharply distinguished it from earlier contradictions. With this confession, the case crossed a definitive threshold. Suspicion gave way to documented admission, and the investigation moved from searching for answers to confirming facts, ushering in the next irrevocable stage of the proceedings. Following Alman Meaker's confession, authorities moved quickly to verify the details he had provided. Acting on the location he described, law enforcement searched the area near the stream where the child was said to have been buried. The remains of Alice were recovered from a shallow grave, consistent with the account given during questioning. This recovery marked the first physical confirmation that the disappearance had ended in death. The body was examined under procedures typical of the period, with particular attention given to signs of poisoning. Although forensic science in the 19th century was still developing, chemical analysis was already employed in suspected poisoning cases. Samples were taken and submitted for examination by a qualified chemistry professor, whose role was to determine whether a toxic substance was present. The results of this analysis proved decisive. The expert testified that strychnine was detected, confirming the presence of a lethal poison within the body. This finding directly corroborated Alman Meaker's confession, linking the recovered remains to the method he had described. The testimony was formally entered into the court record and presented as scientific evidence during subsequent proceedings. With the recovery of the body and the confirmation of poison, the case moved beyond reliance on witness accounts or admissions alone. The physical evidence aligned with the confession and supported the narrative established by investigators. What had begun as community suspicion and fragmented testimony was now reinforced by documented scientific proof, ensuring that the case rested on verifiable facts rather than conjecture. The case moved swiftly into formal judicial proceedings, where the focus shifted from investigation to judgment. Court records document a trial shaped by both confession and corroboration, drawing together months of concern, testimony, and physical evidence into a single legal forum. The courtroom became the setting where private acts were subjected to public scrutiny. Witnesses were called to recount what they had observed while the children lived in the Meaker household. Neighbors testified to repeated instances of harsh punishment, food deprivation, and threats directed specifically at the orphaned children. Their statements, delivered independently yet marked by striking consistency, reinforced the pattern of abuse that had preceded Alice's disappearance. These accounts established context, demonstrating that the child's death did not occur in isolation, but followed a sustained period of mistreatment. The defense sought to mitigate responsibility by framing the household's conduct within the norms of the era and by emphasizing Alman Meaker's direct involvement in the poisoning. Arguments were made suggesting diminished agency on Alice Meaker's part, portraying her as secondary to her husband's actions. This strategy aimed to redirect culpability away from her and onto Alman alone. However, the proceedings took a decisive turn when Alman Meaker formally entered a guilty plea. By admitting his role in the crime, he removed himself from contention as a defendant to be judged by a jury. His plea effectively isolated Alice Meaker as the remaining subject of legal determination. With Alman's guilt established, the full weight of the trial shifted toward evaluating Alice Meaker's conduct, intent, and responsibility, placing her actions at the center of the court's final judgment. The trial concluded with a clear and decisive outcome. After reviewing the testimony, confession, and physical evidence presented, the jury returned a verdict of guilty against Alice Meaker. The judgment reflected not only the immediate crime, but the broader pattern of conduct established through witness accounts and corroborated facts. The court imposed a sentence of death, the most severe penalty available under Vermont law at the time. An appeal was subsequently filed on Alice Meaker's behalf, bringing the case before the Vermont Supreme Court. The appeal challenged the proceedings and the allocation of responsibility, seeking to overturn or reduce the sentence. After review, the court denied the appeal, upholding both the conviction and the sentence. With that decision, all remaining legal avenues were exhausted. The execution was carried out in accordance with state procedure. Official records detail a controlled and formal process, devoid of public spectacle. Alice Meaker was put to death by hanging, bringing the case to its legal conclusion. Her burial followed shortly afterward, conducted without ceremony and recorded as a matter of public record rather than commemoration. The execution carried historical significance beyond the case itself. Alice Meaker became the first woman legally executed in the state of Vermont, a fact that ensured the case would endure in legal and historical archives long after local memory faded. The proceedings ended quietly, but the precedent they set and the circumstances that led to them left a lasting imprint on the state's judicial history. Following the execution, Alice Meaker was buried with little notice. Contemporary records indicate no formal memorial or public acknowledgement beyond the documentation required by law. The burial marked a quiet end to a case that had once unsettled an entire rural community, returning the landscape to outward normalcy while leaving its history permanently altered. Alman Meaker's fate diverged sharply from that of his wife. After his guilty plea, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. In later years, his sentence was commuted, a decision recorded without extensive commentary in official documents. The reduction reflected legal considerations of the time rather than public sympathy, and it closed the final judicial chapter connected to the crime. Within the community, the case left a lasting but subdued impact. Neighbors who had witnessed the household's decline were forced to confront their own inaction, though such reflections were rarely expressed publicly. The farm itself faded back into anonymity, becoming once again indistinguishable from countless others scattered across rural Vermont. Beyond its local consequences, the case exposed deeper structural realities of the 19th century. It revealed the vulnerabilities inherent in informal orphan placement systems, where oversight was minimal, and assumptions about household discipline went largely unquestioned. It also illustrated how accepted norms of corporal punishment could conceal sustained abuse until tragedy forced intervention. The case did not inspire immediate reform, but it remains a documented reminder of how isolation, unchecked authority, and institutional gaps could converge with devastating results, closing the record not with resolution, but with enduring historical weight. Amy Margaret Reeves was born on the 27th of November 1900 in the town of Chertsey, Surrey. She was raised in the small village of Long Cross, a quiet rural settlement situated roughly 20 miles west of central London. The village was modest in size, made up of cottages, narrow lanes, and open common land familiar to the families who lived there. It was here that Amy spent her early years, surrounded by siblings and shaped by the rhythms of a working household. Her father, Arthur Reeves, was employed as a gardener at the Royal Holloway Sanatorium in Egham, located approximately 5 miles from their home. The work was steady and dependable, though the wages were modest. The family lived carefully, without excess, relying on routine and order rather than comfort. Amy's mother, Esther Reeves, managed the household and cared for the children, overseeing daily tasks and maintaining the structure of family life. That structure was disrupted shortly before Christmas in 1910, when Esther Reeves died. Her death altered the atmosphere of the home in a lasting way. The children were left without the constant presence that had guided their days, and the household became quieter, its routines carried on more out of necessity than ease. Though life continued, the absence was felt in every ordinary moment. At 10 years old, Amy attended the local school in keeping with expectations for girls in early 20th century England. Her education focused on basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, alongside domestic instruction intended to prepare her for future work within the home or in service. By all accounts, her days followed a simple and predictable pattern, shaped by family responsibility, schooling, and the ordinary life of a small village. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. This story begins in an ordinary village, much like countless others. Tuesday, the 18th of July, 1911, began without incident in the Reeves household. Amy did not attend the morning lessons at school that day. Instead, she remained at home to assist her older sister Ethel with household chores. The work was ordinary and familiar, and once it was completed, Amy went outside to play in the garden, passing the late morning hours close to home. At around midday, Amy prepared to leave for the afternoon school session. Before setting off, she said goodbye to Ethel and stepped out toward the common. Ethel later recalled watching her sister as she walked across Chobham Common in the direction of the school, following the same route she had taken many times before. Nothing about the moment stood out as unusual. The school day ended promptly at 4 o'clock. As lessons concluded, children began to leave the building and make their way home, most of them traveling together in small groups, talking as they walked. One by one they returned to their houses across the village. Amy, however, did not appear among them. At first, Ethel assumed that her sister had stopped to play somewhere nearby, as children often did during the summer months. As time passed and Amy still had not returned, that assumption began to feel uncertain. Ethel went out to the places where local children usually gathered and asked if anyone had seen her sister. It was there that she learned something unexpected. Several children told her that Amy had not been at school that afternoon at all. With that realization, the situation changed. Amy was not simply late returning home. She was missing. Arthur Reeves returned home at approximately 8:30 that evening. As he arrived, he was met by his eldest daughter, Ethel, who immediately told him that Amy had not come home. For a brief moment he said nothing, standing still as the weight of her words settled in. It was unlike Amy to stay out late, particularly without informing anyone. She was known as a quiet and dependable child, one who did not wander far or act without purpose. After a short pause, Arthur began asking questions. Ethel explained that Amy had left the house shortly after midday, and that she had watched her walk across Chobham Common toward the school. She also told him what she had learned later in the afternoon, that Amy had not been seen at school at all. With this information, Arthur wasted no time. He set down his tools and went out to speak with neighbors, asking if anyone had seen his daughter or noticed anything unusual. When no one could provide an answer, he gathered several local residents, and together they began to search the surrounding area. Lanterns were lit as daylight faded, and the group moved through the village lanes, nearby woods, and across the uneven ground of the common. They checked paths, hedgerows and ditches, calling out and scanning the darkness as they went. As the search continued, anxiety grew with every passing minute. Each place they examined without success deepened the sense that something was wrong. What had begun as concern had now turned into urgency, and the small community found itself drawn together in a shared effort to find a child who should have been safely home hours before. As the search continued into the night, Arthur Reeves moved away from the others and made his way toward a small pond on Chobham Common. The spot lay approximately 400 yards from the family home and was known locally as a place where children sometimes went to paddle during warmer months. It was familiar ground, often passed without notice. When he reached the water's edge, something on the bank caught his attention. A pair of shoes and some stockings had been placed neatly beside the pond, arranged as though they had been carefully removed. Moments later, he saw his daughter. Amy was lying face down in the water, her head among the weeds near the edge. Arthur pulled her from the pond and brought her onto the bank. He looked for any sign that she might still be alive, hoping for movement or breath. But there was none. Her body was cold and lifeless, her dress soaked and clinging to her. In that moment, the reality of what he had found became clear. His daughter was dead. He laid her down and called out for help. Others from the search party soon arrived, lanterns raised as they gathered around the bank. In the flickering light, details began to emerge. There were visible bruises and wounds to Amy's head, and the grass around the edge of the pond appeared disturbed and trampled. These signs suggested that something more than an accidental fall had taken place. As the group took in what they were seeing, it became evident that Amy had not simply wandered into the water. The scene pointed toward an event that had unfolded there, leaving behind traces that could not be ignored. The discovery marked the end of the search, and the beginning of a far more troubling examination. Following the discovery at the pond, the authorities were notified. Police officers and a doctor arrived at Chobham Common later that night to examine the scene. After an initial assessment, Amy Reeves's body was removed and transported to Chertsey Mortuary, where a formal post-mortem examination was arranged. The examination was conducted by Dr. Hodgson. During his assessment, he identified 3 distinct wounds on Amy's head. One was located above the right eyebrow, another on the top of the head, and a third toward the back. Dr. Hodgson noted that while these injuries were not sufficient on their own to cause death, they would likely have been enough to stun the child. He stated that it would have been very difficult for such wounds to have occurred as the result of a simple fall into the pond. Based on his findings, Dr. Hodgson concluded that the cause of death was drowning. The condition of the body suggested that Amy had been alive when she entered the water, and the head injuries may have left her unable to recover once submerged. He further suggested that a blunt instrument, such as a stick, could have caused the wounds observed during the examination. As news of the findings spread, concern extended beyond Long Cross. There had been other troubling incidents involving young girls in the wider region. Edith Neal, a child from near Staines, had previously disappeared after reportedly being lured away by an unknown man and had not been found. In another case, a girl named Alice Dawes had been assaulted on a rural road near Waltham Cross in Essex. Taken together, these events heightened unease throughout the district. Amy Reeves's death was no longer viewed as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a pattern that demanded closer attention. At first light, police officers returned to Chobham Common to continue their examination of the area. The pond where Amy Reeves had been found was small and set low among the bracken, familiar to local children and easily reached from the surrounding cottages. It measured little more than a shallow hollow, known in the village as a place where children had once gone paddling, though in recent years it had become muddy and less frequented. As word of the discovery spread, a heavy stillness settled over Long Cross. The close-knit village, accustomed to quiet routines, now faced an event that few could comprehend. Conversations were subdued, and attention turned toward the unfolding investigation as residents waited for clarity that did not immediately come. It did not take long for police to make an arrest. A local teenage boy was taken into custody on suspicion of murder. Because of his age, his name was not released to the public. The arrest was made as part of the ongoing inquiry, and officers continued to question those who had been in the area on the day Amy disappeared. Evidence gathered from the pond and its surroundings was examined as investigators attempted to establish a clear sequence of events. Later that day, it was announced that an inquest into Amy Reeves's death would be held the following morning, Wednesday, the 19th of July, 1911. Until then, the suspect remained in custody while police pursued additional lines of inquiry. The focus of the case now shifted away from the search and discovery on the common and toward formal proceedings. What had begun as a village tragedy was moving into an institutional setting, where testimony, evidence, and official judgment would determine how the death of a 10-year-old girl would be recorded and understood. The inquest into the death of Amy Reeves was convened at Chertsey Town Hall. Members of the public and the press were present as proceedings began, many of them familiar faces from the surrounding villages. Seated before the court was 15-year-old Albert Henry Hampton, the local boy who had been taken into custody in connection with the case. Before testimony commenced, Superintendent Mears addressed the room. He announced that the hearing would be conducted in accordance with the provisions of the Children's Act of 1908. As a result, members of the public were required to leave the courtroom. The announcement was met with murmurs of surprise and disappointment from those in attendance, but the order was enforced and the doors were cleared. Throughout this process, Albert Hampton remained seated, showing little outward reaction, and it was not clear whether he fully understood the significance of what had been said. Once the inquest formally opened, Superintendent Mears described the scene on Chobham Common where Amy Reeves had been found. He told the court that the pond was little more than a muddy hollow, measuring approximately 11 feet by 10. It contained around 9 inches of water, beneath which lay a further 9 inches of mud, thick with weeds. Rubbish, including discarded tin cans, had collected at the bottom. Superintendent Mears identified this pond as the exact location where Arthur Reeves had discovered his daughter. He then described a stick that had been seen protruding slightly from the water. The branch, later recovered, was a 2-foot length of birch. Embedded in its bark were several strands of long light brown hair which appeared to be human. For comparison, a freshly cut birch branch taken from nearby was also presented to the court. Ethel Reeves was called to give evidence during the inquest. As she began her testimony, she fainted in the witness box, and the proceedings were temporarily paused. After several minutes, she recovered and was able to continue. She told the court that on the morning of Tuesday, the 18th of July, She had seen her sister Amy in the garden with Albert Hampton. According to her account, the two children had lit a small fire, placing bricks around it, and had boiled some water. Ethel explained that Albert was often present at their home, as his aunt and uncle lived next door, and his visits were not unusual. She stated that around noon, Amy came inside the house and asked for a piece of bread and butter. Shortly afterward, Amy left to go to school for the afternoon session. Ethel said she watched her sister leave, but did not accompany her. Later that day, sometime between 2 and 2:30 in the afternoon, Ethel saw Albert Hampton again. She described him as appearing unsettled, as though he wanted to say something but was unsure how to begin. Albert told her that he had been asleep under an apple tree and said that he was on his way to his aunt's house to borrow some tea. Ethel told the court that Albert returned about 30 minutes later. On this occasion, he was still carrying the stick he had earlier been seen with. She said that he joked with her about helping her in the potato patch, and their conversation remained casual. At no point during either interaction did he mention Amy, and Ethel said that she assumed her sister had returned to school as expected. When questioned further, Ethel confirmed that the stick Albert had been carrying that day appeared to have been freshly cut. During further questioning, Ethel Reeves was asked about anyone else she had seen that afternoon. She told the court that sometime between 1 and 1:30, a man she did not recognize came to the house and asked for a glass of water. She said the man was dressed in ordinary working clothes and had arrived on a bicycle. According to Ethel, he told her that he was looking for work and was heading toward Fairview, a house under construction across from the school. She gave him the water, and he left. She did not see him again. Mrs. Martha Stevens was then called to give evidence. She was the wife of John Stevens, Albert Hampton's uncle, and lived next door to the Reeves family. Mrs. Stevens told the court that she had seen Amy briefly at around 10 o'clock on the morning of the 18th of July. She said that she had also seen her nephew that day, and that he had told her he was looking for work. She stated that she did not hear any screams or sounds of distress, and did not see anyone carrying a stick. Mrs. Stevens described Albert as gentle by nature, and said that he had never shown signs of bad temper. She spoke of his work history in the village, his family's poor health, and noted that he sang in the church choir. To her knowledge, there had never been any quarrel between Albert and the Reeves family. Inspector Pike also gave testimony. He said that he arrived at the pond at approximately 11:15 that night, after Amy's body had been removed from the water. He observed that her boots and stockings had been placed neatly on the bank, and that her clothing was saturated with mud and water. Nearby, he noted a freshly cut birch tree about 200 yards from the pond. Later, during a search of a woodshed behind Mrs. Stevens' home, he found a wood chopper with leaves clinging to its blade, which he said matched those found near the pond. Inspector Pike told the court that when Albert Hampton was arrested and informed of the charge, he replied, "I'm sure it was not me, sir." At the station, his only response was a quiet, "No." The inquest resumed on Tuesday the 25th of July, 1911, 1 week after Amy Reeves had been killed. Arthur Reeves was present in the gallery, seated quietly as proceedings continued. Albert Henry Hampton, still just 15 years old, was brought into the courtroom under guard and remained seated throughout, watching with little expression. The first witness called. That day was Albert Reeves, Amy's 12-year-old brother. He told the court that on the 18th of July he had gone to school with his younger sister Winnie and returned home shortly before 1 o'clock. As he approached the house, he noticed Albert Hampton standing in his aunt's garden. Later in the afternoon, after lunch, he saw him again and described his manner as restless, saying that he appeared to be watching what was happening around him. Police had by then identified the man who had come to the Reeves home asking for water. He was named as William Scammell, a painter from Egham. Taking the stand, Scammell said that he had arrived in Longcross at about 20 minutes to 2 in the afternoon while looking for work. He confirmed that he had gone to the Reeves house because of the heat and had been given water by a young woman he later learned was Ethel Reeves. He said that he then cycled to Fairview, a house under construction opposite Longcross Hill, but was turned away. On his return journey toward Egham, he passed a man named John Tabor and later a man driving a coal cart. He stated that these were the only people he saw. Dr. George Hodgson also gave further medical evidence. He described Amy's condition when he examined her, noting the presence of mud in her mouth, on her teeth, and on the right side of her face and head. He identified 4 wounds to her head and stated that while these injuries would have stunned the child, they were not in themselves fatal. In his opinion, the cause of death was drowning. Flora Batchelor, a neighbor of the Reeves family, was next called to give evidence. She told the court that on the morning of the 18th of July, she had seen Albert Hampton carrying what she described as a stout stick. According to her testimony, Albert remarked that it was a cherry stick and commented that it would make a fine cudgel. At this point, the court rose. Near intervened to explain that a cudgel was a short, thick stick, typically used as a weapon and easily wielded with one hand. The statement drew attention to a growing inconsistency in the evidence. While Albert Hampton had referred to the stick he carried as cherrywood, the branch recovered from the pond was identified as birch. This discrepancy had already been noted during earlier testimony and now formed a central point of consideration. Professor Pepper, a forensic expert from the Home Office, was then called. He told the court that he had examined the stick found standing upright in the mud of the pond. Embedded in its bark were strands of light brown hair, which he said were consistent with Amy Reeves's hair color. Based on his examination, Professor Pepper gave the opinion that the child had likely been standing in the pond when she was struck. He suggested that several blows had been delivered in quick succession, causing her to fall into the water, where she drowned. Other witnesses also placed Albert Hampton in the area that day. Several said they had seen him carrying a carpet bag slung over his shoulder, which he did not appear to put down. His manner, they noted, was generally quiet, though some described him as hesitant and uncertain. There were also reports that Albert had told police he had seen a tallish man on the common. Mrs. Stevens was recalled and confirmed that her nephew had mentioned such a man to her earlier that afternoon. When given the opportunity to give evidence under oath, Albert Hampton declined. In his summation, the coroner addressed the evidence that had been presented over the course of the inquest. He stated that the only direct physical link between Albert Hampton and the death of Amy Reeves was the birch stick found in the pond, with human hair attached to it. He reminded the jury that there had been conflicting testimony regarding the stick, noting that while some witnesses described Albert carrying a freshly cut stick, others had heard him refer to it as cherrywood. The coroner further pointed out that police had later located a cherry stick in the place where Albert said he had left it, and confirmed that a cherry branch had been freshly cut. The coroner told the jury that there appeared to be no clear motive. Albert Hampton had been friendly with the Reeves family and particularly with Amy. There was no evidence of a quarrel and no sign of any indecent assault. He acknowledged the possibility that another, unidentified person may have encountered the child at the pond and attacked her for reasons that could not be explained. He cautioned the jury that while circumstantial evidence could be persuasive, it must be weighed carefully. After deliberating for 25 minutes, the jury returned with its verdict. They concluded that Amy Reeves had been willfully murdered, but that there was insufficient evidence to determine who was responsible. Despite the finding, Albert Hampton was not immediately released. He was returned to Brixton Prison while the investigation continued. The following day, he was released on bail of £25. On Friday, the 4th of August 1911, after further inquiries failed to produce new evidence, Albert Henry Hampton was formally discharged. No one else was ever charged with the crime. In the years that followed, Albert remained in Surrey until the outbreak of the Great War. He later enlisted in the British Army, serving with the 4th Hussars. On the 7th of July 1917, he was wounded in action, sustaining injuries to both legs, the right more seriously. His service earned him the Distinguished Conduct Medal. The death of 10-year-old Amy Reeves was never resolved. No further arrests were made, and the case remains officially unsolved.